Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Paul Jay in Washington. And in Washington, the House has passed a bill that will provide funding for states to avoid more teacher layoffs. And a great debate has broken out. Is this good for the economy or not? The Republicans want to keep the Bush tax cuts in place, saying that's a good stimulant for the economy. Others are saying direct funding by states in infrastructure and schools is a much better form of stimulus and growing the economy. A new study is coming out today. It's from the Perry Institute, and it's put out by Jeffrey Thompson, who's an assistant research professor at Perry. And he says his study proves investment in infrastructure, in fact, is the best way to create jobs. And now joining us from the Perry Institute in Amherst, Massachusetts, is Jeffrey Thompson. He's a research professor there, and he focuses on labor economics, public finance, income inequality. Thanks for joining us, Jeffrey.
Thanks for having me.
So what does your study show? You focused mostly on the New England states, but you think your data applies more or less across the country. What have you proved?
What I've done is I've reviewed a large number of studies looking at the relative payoff of different approaches to economic development. And what we find is that when states take effort to invest in education and build their infrastructure, the payoff in terms of short-term job creation and long-term economic growth far outweighs alternative approaches which focus on giving tax cuts to corporations.
Well, in your study, one of the things you state is this, and I'll quote, "Each additional dollar spent on public infrastructure benefits businesses and households by as much as $1.37. So how do you come to that number?
That's a finding from a researcher in Michigan who looks at the national evidence, state-level data across the country, and looks at the benefits that people derive from infrastructure projects, looks at the benefits that businesses derive from those infrastructure projects, and finds that the economic value overall outweighs the cost.
So in your study, you break down several examples of what public infrastructure spending might be and what the consequences would be. So start with the issue of elementary school size, which is one of the big debates that came out of this recent vote in the House.
There were some interesting experimental projects done in Tennessee looking at reducing class size and finding out, tracking the students who benefited by having smaller class sizes, and found out that over the long haul, those students were more able to find jobs, found better jobs, were more successful in school, graduated more. And so the researchers looking at those particular findings and seeing what the implications were of a large-scale investment of that size found that there were large and beneficial impacts in the economy, far outweighing the costs of reducing class size.
Well, you come to a number of $66,000 benefit over a 20-year period. How do you come to a calculation like that? Because part of what happens in these debates is people don't understand methodology. So when they hear numbers, I don't know how seriously they take them.
Sure, no, that's a good point. I mean, in this particular case, the researchers tracked the students over many years, and they also tried to do a comprehensive assessment of what the costs of delivering the experiment were, what the costs of actually lowering class sizes were, and then they stretched that out over 20 years and said, over a 20-year period, what are the benefits? Adding up all the benefits that accrue from the improved economic success, improved academic success of the students, and then looking at what the comparative alternative uses of that funding would have been, and essentially calculated what's in the economics terms as the net present value of that program over a 20-year period, and found out that over a long period the benefits outweigh the costs.
So 25, just as simple as 25 students per class getting down to 15 students per class has this kind of a benefit, $66,000 over 20 years.
That's right.
All right, let's take another one. You talk about comprehensive high school reforms. First of all, what do you mean by comprehensive high school reforms? And you're saying comprehensive high school reform efforts raise the long-term earnings of graduates 17%, boost attendance, reading, and math scores, and generate net social benefits that exceed program costs by nearly $150,000 per student over 20 years.
Yeah, in that instance, there are a couple of different approaches to what can broadly be called comprehensive reform, educational reform at the high school level. In the report, we talk about the experimental findings from two different approaches. One is called First Things First, and these different approaches essentially involves small class sizes, but they also have the teachers remain with the students for a period of several years. They have fairly intensive mentoring and counseling services, and the school is able to operate in a different way from your typical school. Smaller size, closer contact. In one of the instances, the Reform Initiative has an explicit career focus, exposing the high school students to contact with employers, helping them get on-the-job experience, mentorships, internships, things of that nature. And the intensive involvement and the intensive improvement of the educational environment overall has dramatic effects. And they were able to see that in an experimental context. So some students were randomly assigned to this sort of educational experience, and other students were left in your traditional educational approach. And they found that tracking those students over a long period, that they were more likely to graduate, and the jobs they got were paid better, and they were more likely to go on to higher education. So again, it's a long-term analysis of how these students perform relative to students that didn't get exposed to that sort of intensive educational experience. And the payoff in the numbers that you quoted from the study are fairly dramatic. When you add up the benefits year in, year out over a 20-year period and compare that to the costs of delivering that service, the gains are dramatic.
Now, you also recommending state investment in infrastructure projects and talk about the relationship of that to more employment. I'll quote another piece of your study. As infrastructure investments have declined, the list of critical infrastructure in need of replacement and repair has grown. Between 1/4 and 2/3 of major roads in New England are in poor or mediocre condition, and 40% of bridges are structurally deficient or functionally obsolete. Over the next 20 years, New England needs nearly $13 billion in additional investment in drinking water infrastructure. Transit systems and school facilities in the region also need millions of dollars of investments just to maintain current capacity. But if that's the state of New England infrastructure, first of all, is that typical across the country?
Unfortunately, it is typical. There aren't too many areas where New England stands far above or far below, depending on your perspective, the infrastructure needs in the rest of the country. In New England, you've got 17,000 bridges, and 14% of them are structurally deficient. 40% are either structurally deficient or functionally obsolete. Nationwide, that figure is 25%. So things might be a little bit worse on bridges in New England, but still across the country, there are countless numbers of bridges. I mean, there are scores of bridges that need repair. The same is true for roads and drinking water infrastructure. So the entire country is in need of a boost in its infrastructure spending. And what we've seen is that the payoff in terms of immediate employment, or at least over the course of several months after a project is initiated, is an important source of employment, and it also boosts an area's long-term economic growth.
What did you find about that? Because that's the debate. The right wing on this issue, or the Republicans and people who think like they do, say maybe you get some quick short-term benefits, but the real effect in the private sector isn't there. What is the relationship of public spending on bridges and roads and jobs in the private sector?
Well, at the end of the day, which I think is the most important detail to focus on, private sector businesses do appreciate the improved transportation when you improve the bridges and the roads. And they also, to function, they need smooth sewer and water access. They need it to be affordable and functioning. So at the end of the day, private sector businesses do benefit. And the research shows that it does have an overall effect on economic growth, and that it lowers the costs that businesses face. So I think that in terms of valuing the end product of infrastructure improvement, businesses do benefit and the overall economy benefits. The only source of real disagreement, I think, has to do with how those projects are funded, and there is a debate over taxation, how these projects will be paid for.
Yeah, when I look at the election signs are starting to go up for November, and the sign I'm seeing on many lawns or corners is lower taxes, more jobs.
There is certainly an element of truth to that idea at the federal level. The federal government can engage in deficit spending, which is stimulative to the economy. So that's absolutely true. At the state level, that lesson certainly does not apply.
Hang on one sec, because most of the candidates that are saying lower taxes, more jobs are also saying no deficit spending.
Yeah, so there's no small amount of inconsistency in terms of concern over levels of deficits and wanting to cut taxes as well. It's hard to deal with someone with that sort of inconsistency, but the important lessons, I think, are that at the federal level, when the federal government engages in deficit spending, it is stimulative to the economy over the short term. We have to be able to separate our understanding of long-term fiscal management, and if you have uncontrolled, out of control deficits looking as far as the eye can see, that is not sustainable. But that's not the course we're on. The course we're on is that currently and in the next year or two, the share of the total deficit the country faces is made up about a third of the stimulus efforts over the last couple of years. The rest of it is because of the bad economy and the Bush tax cuts and the cost of the war. When you look 10 years down the road to the long-term deficit picture, the costs of these economic stimulus efforts are almost entirely phased out. Over the long run, our concerns over the deficit are almost exclusively about the Bush tax cuts and about the costs of paying for a couple of wars. So if you're truly concerned about deficits, it's not about these short-term economic stimulus efforts.
So if I understand your study correctly, you're telling people that even if at the federal level things are now somewhat paralyzed politically, it's still worth it for states to raise state taxes on the affluent in order to pay for this infrastructure spending because the net benefit socially is worth it. Is that the main argument?
That is the main argument. When affluent households face tax increase at the state level, they do reduce their level of spending. But that reduction is far outstripped by the job gains from investments in education, investments in infrastructure that really are going to benefit the entire state.
Thanks very much for joining us, Jeffrey.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us on the Real News Network. And if you want to see Jeffrey's study, the executive summary is on the Perry website. It's also on the Real News website. We'll put it right underneath the player. So if you're on the Real News, you look down and you'll see it. And thanks again for joining us on the Real News.